The last normal car I processed was a silver sedan at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. The driver handed me exact change without looking up from his phone, and I waved him through like I'd done 10,000 times before. By 7:15 p.m., the traffic had tripled. By 8 p.m., I understood that my tiny glass box on Highway 40 had become a front-row seat to the end of civilization. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been a toll collector for 6 years. People think it's mindless work, and maybe it was, until the night the cities started emptying. The booth sits on a rural stretch of interstate, about 60 miles west of the metropolitan sprawl, surrounded by farmland and forest. 3 lanes in each direction, a small maintenance building behind the plaza, and enough elevation to see headlights coming from miles away. I never thought that vantage point would become the reason I'm still breathing. The first sign something was catastrophically wrong came through the radio. Not the official channels, which kept playing the same 3 pop songs on loop, but the scanner I kept tucked under the counter to break up the monotony of 8-hour shifts. Emergency frequencies erupted with chatter about a hospital in the city losing containment of something. The dispatcher's voice kept breaking up, kept saying the same phrase over and over. Multiple casualties, aggressive behavior, biting incidents. Traffic kept increasing. Sedans became SUVs, became pickup trucks, packed with belongings tied down with whatever rope people could find. I watched a man in a BMW throw $300 in bills at me when I told him the toll was $4.50, screaming at me to keep the change and open the gate faster. His eyes held something I'd never seen in 6 years of collecting tolls. Absolute primal terror, the kind that bypasses rational thought and plugs straight into the brainstem where survival instincts live. Around 9:30 p.m., my supervisor called. Derek had worked toll operations for 20 years and never sounded rattled by anything. His voice came through the phone tight and high-pitched. "Marcus, I need you to stay in the booth. Don't leave your post. I know it sounds insane with what's happening, but the state police are setting up checkpoints, and they need our cameras operational. Can you do that?" I told him yes, because I'd never had a reason to say no to Derek, and because the alternative was joining the river of panicked humanity flowing past my window. The cars had stopped being orderly. Vehicles were using the shoulder now, creating a 4th lane of desperate acceleration. I processed the last few cars that actually stopped to pay. Then someone sideswiped my booth hard enough to crack the outer panel, and I hit the automatic gate override, letting everyone through free. The maintenance building behind the toll plaza had always been off-limits to us collectors. It housed the electrical systems, backup generators, and various equipment the highway department used for repairs. I'd been inside maybe twice in 6 years, always with a supervisor. But Derek had mentioned the cameras, and those systems ran from that building. And some part of my brain was already calculating that the 8-by-8-foot glass booth I sat in wouldn't protect me from whatever had turned the city into an evacuation zone. By 11 p.m., the traffic had become a solid wall of metal moving at 5 miles per hour. Horns created a symphony of desperation. I watched fights break out when someone tried to merge. 2 men got out of their vehicles and started swinging at each other in the middle of the highway, while their families watched from rolled-up windows. Nobody stopped to help. Nobody stopped at all. The human river just flowed around them like water around stones. Midnight brought a new sound underneath the horns and engines. Sirens. Police cruisers, ambulances, fire trucks, all trying to navigate against the flow of traffic heading west. I watched them give up one by one, pulling onto the median and sitting there with lights still spinning, as useless as toys. A state trooper actually got out and walked up to my booth, his uniform disheveled and his face covered in something dark that might have been blood or might have been dirt. He asked me if I had water. I handed him the thermos I'd brought from home. He drank the entire thing in 6 long swallows, then looked at me with exhausted eyes. "It's bad in the city. Real bad. People are attacking each other. Not fighting. Attacking. Like animals. The hospitals can't handle the volume. They're saying it spreads through bites. The word spreads. hit differently than any other word in his sentence. Spreads implied contagion. Spreads implied that whatever was happening wasn't isolated to the city. Spreads implied that every single car rushing past my booth might be carrying the thing they were running from. What should I do? I asked him, and I hated how small my voice sounded. He handed back my empty thermos. Stay away from the cities. Stay away from people. Find somewhere you can lock the doors and wait for the government to handle this. Then he walked back to his cruiser and sat there on the median, and I never saw him move again. When dawn came 12 hours later, his vehicle was still there, but the door hung open and the officer was gone. The first night was chaos. The second day was worse because the chaos had patterns now. I'd moved into the maintenance building around 3 a.m., hauling everything useful from the booth in 3 trips. The building was concrete block construction with one entrance, no windows, and shelves stocked with road salt, tools, and emergency supplies that were supposed to last a crew through winter storms. 2 cases of bottled water, a dozen MRE-style meal packs that highway workers used during long shifts, a first aid kit, a radio, and most importantly, a secondary control panel that let me monitor the toll plaza's camera feeds and access the backup generator. I locked the door. I pushed a heavy equipment cabinet against it. I sat on the concrete floor and watched traffic through the camera feeds as the sun rose on what would be the last normal sunrise I'd ever see. Traffic continued through the second day, but the composition had changed. Fewer family sedans now, more trucks, more vehicles overloaded with supplies strapped to roofs and stuffed into every available space. I watched a bus go past with faces pressed against every window, so many people packed inside that the suspension sagged. I watched motorcycles weave between stalled vehicles. I watched a horse trailer being pulled by a pickup truck, and I wondered if the horses inside understood that the world was ending. Around noon on that second day, the traffic stopped moving entirely, not slowed. Stopped. A solid wall of metal stretching in both directions as far as the cameras could see. People got out of their cars. They milled around on the highway. Some tried to walk west, abandoning their vehicles entirely. Others set up camps right there on the asphalt, pulling out camping equipment and portable stoves, as if this was a temporary inconvenience rather than the complete collapse of infrastructure. That's when I noticed the smoke, black columns rising from the direction of the city, thick enough to blur the horizon. Multiple fires, big ones, the kind that take entire city blocks to fuel. The radio had stopped playing music. Now it cycled between emergency broadcast tones and a recorded message telling people to stay in their homes, avoid contact with infected individuals, and await further instructions. The message repeated every 3 minutes. I counted. The afternoon brought the first infected person into view of my cameras. At least I think that's what he was. The figure moved wrong, like his joints didn't quite bend the way human joints should. He walked along the shoulder of the highway, passing the stopped traffic, and I watched multiple people roll up their windows as he approached. He stopped at a minivan, pressed his face against the glass, then moved on when nobody opened the door. The camera quality wasn't good enough to see his expression, but his movements had a purposeless quality that reminded me of wind-up toys running into walls. More came as the afternoon wore on. Individuals at first, then pairs, then groups. They moved through the traffic jam with that same jerky gait, stopping at vehicles, sometimes pounding on windows. I watched a man get out of his truck to confront one of them. Bad idea. The infected person lunged faster than I thought possible. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, and I looked away from that particular camera feed because I didn't need to see what happened next to know how it ended. Gunshots started around 4 p.m., scattered at first, then increasing in frequency. People were defending themselves. People were panicking and shooting at shadows. The traffic jam was becoming a war zone, and I was sitting in a concrete box 300 feet away with 6 inches of cinder block between me and the chaos. Night fell on the second day, and the highway became a river of headlights and muzzle flashes. I turned off the maintenance building's exterior light. I sat in darkness and watched the camera feeds, keeping the volume on the monitors low. Screams carried through the concrete walls anyway. Human screams have a particular pitch when they're driven by absolute terror. You can't mistake it for anything else. I heard that pitch dozens of times through the second night. By the third morning, maybe half the people who'd been camping on the highway were gone. Either they'd moved on foot, or they'd become the shambling figures that now wandered between the abandoned vehicles in increasing numbers. The infected didn't seem to need rest. They moved constantly, drawn by movement and sound. I watched one spend 40 minutes trying to get into a sedan where someone had clearly barricaded themselves inside. It pounded on the window with mechanical persistence until the glass finally cracked, then broke. Then the camera angle prevented me from seeing the conclusion. Have you ever watched society unravel in real time, one set of headlights at a time, knowing you're witnessing something that can never be undone? If you understand that specific flavor of helplessness mixed with horrified fascination, then you'll grasp why I couldn't look away from the highway, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. Keep watching, because what I witnessed over the next 72 hours taught me more about humanity than the previous 32 years of my existence ever did. Hit that like button and subscribe. You're going to want to follow this journey to its conclusion. The third day was when the last organized vehicles tried to push through. A convoy of National Guard trucks appeared from the east, moving against the flow on the median. They made it maybe 2 miles before infected swarmed them. I watched soldiers bail out, firing into crowds that didn't stop coming. The trucks sat abandoned an hour later, adding to the monument of failed evacuation that my highway had become. That afternoon, the traffic jam caught fire. I don't know how it started. Maybe someone knocked over a camping stove. Maybe a vehicle's engine finally overheated and ignited. But fire doesn't care about causation, and once it started, it moved through the densely packed cars like a living thing. Black smoke obscured the cameras for hours. When it cleared, entire sections of the highway were just charred frames and melted rubber. The heat from the fire was intense enough that I could feel it through the concrete walls of the maintenance building, even though the flames were several hundred yards away. I watched families run from the blaze, dragging children and whatever belongings they could carry. Some ran west toward the unknown. Others ran east back toward the city they'd fled. Most didn't make it far before the infected caught them. The fire created panic, and panic created movement. And movement attracted every infected creature within visual range. I counted 17 people get pulled down within my camera's field of view during the fire. 17 distinct moments where human beings ceased to be human beings and became food, then eventually became more infected. The transformation wasn't immediate like in movies. People didn't pop back up 30 seconds after being bitten. It took hours, sometimes most of a day. But eventually, everyone who got bitten stood back up with that same jerky gait, that same blank expression, that same relentless, purposeless wandering. The fourth day brought silence. No more engines, no more horns, no more gunshots. Just wind and the occasional scrape of infected feet on asphalt. I counted 47 of them visible on various camera feeds, wandering through the automotive graveyard that stretched for miles in both directions. My elevated position on the toll plaza showed me the full scope of the disaster. Thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of people who'd tried to escape the city only to die within sight of safety they'd never reach. I sat in the maintenance building and took inventory of my situation with the kind of cold calculation that survival demands. Water, 2 cases, 48 bottles total, enough for maybe 3 weeks if I was careful. Food, 12 MRE packs, call it 12 days of calories if I rationed. Power, backup generator with fuel for approximately 2 weeks of minimal use. Defensibility, 1 entrance, concrete walls, no windows. Good. Visibility, Camera feeds covering the entire toll plaza and half a mile of highway in each direction. Excellent. Escape routes, none that didn't require walking through a horde of infected. Problematic. The maintenance building itself measured roughly 20 feet by 30 feet. Most of that space was taken up by equipment, the generator, electrical panels, shelving units holding supplies, workbenches covered in tools, and the camera monitoring station that had become my window to the world. In one corner, I'd cleared a space for sleeping, laying out emergency blankets over the concrete floor. Not comfortable, but comfort was a luxury from the old world. In another corner, I'd designated a bathroom area with a bucket and a privacy screen made from a tarp. Dignity was also a luxury, but I maintained what I could. The camera system ran on the building's main power, which meant I needed to use the backup generator sparingly. I established a schedule. Cameras on for 2 hours in the morning to assess overnight changes, off for 4 hours, on for 2 hours at midday, off for 4 hours, on for 2 hours in the evening, off overnight. This pattern would let me stretch the generator fuel for weeks instead of days. During the off periods, I sat in darkness and listened to the world outside through the concrete walls. You're probably wondering if I tried to call for help. Of course I did. Cell service died on day 2. The landline in the maintenance building worked for exactly 1 call on day 3. I reached an emergency operator who told me rescue operations were suspended indefinitely and I should shelter in place. Then the line went dead and never came back. The radio continued broadcasting the same emergency message on loop until day 5, when it switched to static and then nothing. So I adapted. Humans are good at that when the alternative is death. I established routines because routines create structure, and structure creates the illusion of control even when you have none. Wake up, eat half an MRE, check the camera feeds, monitor for threats, document everything in a journal I'd found in a desk drawer, exercise to maintain strength, check cameras again, eat the other half of the MRE, force myself to sleep, repeat. The journal became my confidant, my therapist, my connection to sanity. I wrote everything, not just the practical details about supply levels and infected counts, but the emotional weight of isolation, the fear that crept in during the dark hours, the strange, guilty relief that I'd survived when so many hadn't, the way my hands shook during those first weeks every time I had to venture outside the building. Writing forced me to process instead of just suppressing, and processing kept me functional. Week 2 brought rain, heavy storms that lasted 3 days and turned the highway into a shallow river. The infected didn't seem to care about weather. They wandered through the downpour with the same purposeless persistence, clothes plastered to their bodies, water streaming off their faces. But the rain did something useful. It washed away a lot of the blood and debris, making the cameras easier to read. It also created a new resource opportunity that would prove vital. I realized I could collect rainwater from the maintenance building's roof drainage system. The downspouts emptied into a drainage ditch, but I found buckets and plastic containers in the supply area. During a break in the storm, I ventured outside for the first time since moving into the building. The act of opening that door, of exposing myself to the outside air, sent my heart rate through the ceiling. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, stay hidden, stay safe. But I needed water, and water meant going outside. The infected, closest to the toll plaza, was about 100 yards away, facing the opposite direction. I moved quickly but quietly, positioning the buckets under the downspouts, then retreating back inside. The whole operation took maybe 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes taught me critical information. The infected responded to movement more than sound. If I stayed low and moved deliberately rather than frantically, I could avoid attracting attention. This knowledge would prove vital for future supply runs. The rain gave me something else. Nearly 20 gallons of water collected over 3 days. I boiled it using a camping stove I'd found in the maintenance building's supply closet, then stored it in every container I could find. This single collection event extended my water supply from 3 weeks to potentially 2 months. It also gave me hope that long-term survival might actually be possible if I was smart and resourceful. Week 3 introduced a new problem: boredom. Humans aren't designed for this level of isolation. We're social creatures, wired for interaction and communication. The absence of social contact creates a specific kind of psychological erosion that's hard to describe unless you've experienced it. The silence becomes oppressive. Your own thoughts become too loud. You start questioning whether you're still sane, or if you've already crossed some invisible line and just don't realize it yet. I started talking to myself, first just muttering while I worked, then full conversations where I'd argue both sides of decisions. Should I ration the food more strictly to extend supplies, or eat adequately to maintain strength for scavenging? Risk a supply run today when infected density was low, or wait for better conditions that might never come? These internal debates helped organize my thinking, but they also highlighted how desperately I missed human interaction. Then I started talking to the infected on the camera feeds. I'd narrate their movements like a nature documentary, giving them backstories and personalities. Here we see the infected male attempting to navigate a Jersey barrier. His motor control is severely impaired, leading to repeated failed attempts. Fascinating. Before the outbreak, this gentleman probably had a job and a family. Now he spends his days trying to climb concrete. Such is life in the post-apocalypse. I gave them names. The infected, who appeared regularly on my cameras, became characters in the twisted show I watched daily. There was Jerry, distinguishable by his red jacket, who spent hours every day trying to get into the same overturned semi-truck. Whatever was inside that truck fascinated him endlessly. There was Patricia, wearing a bright yellow jacket that made her easy to spot, who wandered in circles around a specific section of highway like she was stuck in a loop. There was Marcus Jr. I named him after myself in a moment of dark humor, who'd lost his left arm somehow and whose lopsided gait made him instantly recognizable at any distance. Naming them was either a coping mechanism or an early sign of psychological breakdown, probably both. But it made the surveillance easier. I could track individuals, learn their patterns, predict their movements. Jerry never wandered south of the toll plaza. Patricia stuck to a roughly 100-yard circle around a blue sedan. Marcus Jr. moved more than the others, covering maybe a quarter-mile of highway during his daily wanderings. He was the dangerous one, the unpredictable variable I always had to account for during supply runs. Week 4 was when I ran out of MREs. I'd been stretching them as far as possible, eating maybe 1,000 calories a day when my body needed twice that. I supplemented with the minimal food I'd brought from my original shift. A bag of almonds that lasted 3 days, an apple that went from fresh to brown to completely inedible in 48 hours, and a granola bar I made last 4 days by eating it in tiny pieces. But eventually, the math caught up. I needed food, and the only food available was in the vehicles scattered across the highway. Scavenging meant going outside. Going outside meant exposure to infected. Exposure meant potential death. But starvation was certain death, just slower and more painful. I spent an entire day planning my first supply run, studying the camera feeds, tracking infected movements, identifying the nearest vehicles that might contain useful supplies. A minivan sat approximately 50 yards from the maintenance building, driver's door hanging open, clearly abandoned in a hurry. From the camera angle, I could see the outline of shopping bags in the back seat. Groceries, maybe. Or maybe just someone's laundry. Or maybe nothing useful at all. But it was close, and the infected traffic in that area was relatively light, and I was out of options. I went at dawn on day 29, because the infected seemed slightly less active in early morning. Maybe the cold slowed them down. Maybe they were responding to circadian rhythms left over from their human days. I didn't care about the mechanism, just the pattern. Morning meant safer, so morning was when I moved. I equipped myself as best I could with what was available. A tire iron from the tool bench. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. I'd tied strips of cloth torn from an old tarp around my boots to muffle footsteps. I wore dark clothing to blend with the asphalt and shadows. I'd covered my face with a bandana in case whatever caused the infection was airborne, though that horse had probably left the barn weeks ago. And I carried a mesh bag to hold whatever I found, leaving my hands free for movement and defense. The walk to the minivan took 6 minutes that felt like 6 hours. Every step required perfect attention. Check the immediate area visually. Scan the camera feeds one more time before leaving the building. Listen for the shuffle scrape of infected movement. Take 3 steps. Stop. Assess. Repeat. Jerry was visible about 100 yards south, still obsessing over his semi-truck. Patricia was in her usual circle but facing away. Marcus Jr. was nowhere in sight, which was either very good or very bad. The air outside smelled wrong. That's the detail that hit me hardest during that first supply run. The world smelled like rot and smoke and something else I couldn't identify. Death, maybe, or the absence of life. All the normal smells of civilization. Car exhaust, asphalt, the green scent of nearby fields had been replaced with this overwhelming odor of wrongness. I breathed through my mouth and kept moving. The minivan's interior smelled even worse. Something had died in there, though I couldn't see a body. Maybe the smell had seeped in from outside. Maybe it was just groceries gone bad in the heat, then frozen in the cold, creating a bacterial nightmare. I didn't investigate too carefully. I grabbed the shopping bags from the back seat without looking too closely at their contents and prepared to move back toward the maintenance building. That's when Marcus Jr. appeared from behind a pickup truck 30 yards away. We made eye contact, or at least I think we did. His face had the blank expression I'd seen on all the infected, eyes unfocused and mouth slack. But his body reacted immediately to my presence. He lunged forward with that characteristic jerky speed, arms outstretched, mouth opening in a silent snarl that showed broken teeth. I ran. There's no dignity in survival, no room for pride or tactical thinking when a monster is sprinting at you with the singular goal of tearing you apart. I just ran, clutching the shopping bags, my cloth-wrapped boots slapping against asphalt despite my attempts at stealth. The maintenance building was 20 yards away. Then 10 yards, Marcus Jr.'s footsteps pounded right behind me, close enough that I could hear his ragged breathing, close enough that I expected to feel his hands grab my shoulders at any second. 5 yards. I hit the maintenance building door at full speed, shouldered it open with my entire body weight, threw the bags inside, spun and slammed the door just as Marcus Jr.'s body crashed against it from outside. The impact shook the entire frame. My hands fumbled with the lock, fingers suddenly clumsy with adrenaline. He hit the door again, then again. I got the lock engaged and stumbled backward, tire iron raised, waiting for the door to fail. He pounded on the metal for 2 hours. Steady, mechanical impacts that rang through the building like a funeral bell. Each strike sent vibrations through the concrete floor. I sat with my back against the far wall, tire iron in hand, watching the door flex slightly with each hit. The door was solid steel, designed to withstand weather and potential vandalism, but I'd never considered whether it could withstand a sustained assault from an infected human with no sense of self-preservation or pain. Eventually, the pounding stopped. I checked the cameras and watched Marcus Jr. shuffle away, his right hand now bent at an unnatural angle from striking the door repeatedly. He'd broken his own hand and hadn't even noticed. He just wandered back into the traffic jam, already forgetting why he'd been pounding on that particular door. The infected had no memory, no planning capability, no real intelligence, just stimulus and response, hunger and wandering. My hands shook for 3 hours after he left. I sat on the floor of the maintenance building, unable to move, replaying those seconds when he'd chased me. How close had he been? 6 inches? A foot? If I'd been 1 second slower getting the door closed, would I be wandering the highway now with that same blank expression? The near miss rattled me more than the actual danger had. In the moment, I'd been pure survival instinct. Afterward, I had time to imagine all the ways it could have gone wrong. But the shopping bags contained treasures beyond measure. 6 cans of soup, chicken noodle, tomato, and some kind of vegetable medley. A box of granola bars with 8 bars remaining. 3 bottles of juice that hadn't frozen and burst despite the cold. A loaf of bread that was only half moldy. I'd cut away the bad parts and toast the rest. Peanut butter, nearly a full jar, and a bag of beef jerky that alone was worth the terror of the supply run. Enough food for maybe 2 weeks if I was careful. I sat on the floor and ate an entire granola bar without rationing, just to celebrate being alive. It was the best granola bar I'd ever tasted. Every bite was a victory. I was alive. I had food. The door had held. These were the wins I counted now. Small and immediate and vital. Comment below if you've ever faced a moment where 1 second made the difference between living and dying. Share this story with someone who thinks they understand fear. You don't know fear until you hear footsteps behind you and know that stopping means death. That first supply run taught me critical lessons I'd rely on for the next 3 months. 1. I could move through the infected zone if I was smart and careful and very lucky. 2. Vehicle interiors often contained food because people had been evacuating with whatever they could grab in their panic. 3. The infected would lose interest if you removed the stimulus. Out of sight really did mean out of mind for creatures with no cognitive function beyond basic stimulus response. And 4. The adrenaline crash after a near-death experience is absolutely brutal and had to be accounted for in my planning. I started scavenging regularly after that. Every 3 or 4 days, I'd plan a route, wait for optimal conditions, and venture into the automotive graveyard to gather supplies. I developed techniques and strategies born from trial and error, and several more close calls. Travel in early morning when infected were slower and fewer seemed to be actively moving. Avoid vehicles with open doors that other scavengers might have already looted. Target family vehicles, minivans, SUVs, station wagons, because families packed food for kids. Never ever make noise. Move like you're underwater. Slow, deliberate, efficient. The highway became my hunting ground. I mapped it mentally, dividing it into zones based on infected density and supply potential. The eastbound lanes had fewer infected, but had been more thoroughly picked over by other survivors before the situation got completely out of control. The westbound lanes were dangerous but resource-rich, because the fire had driven away both infected and survivors, leaving supplies untouched. The median was a no-go zone where infected tended to cluster around the abandoned National Guard vehicles. I found useful items beyond food. Bottled water, obviously. Any vehicle with water became a priority target. A better knife than the rusty blade I'd found in the maintenance building. This one a proper hunting knife with a 6-inch blade. Flashlights and batteries to supplement the maintenance building's limited lighting. A portable radio that picked up nothing but static but made me feel connected to the possibility of civilization. Warmer clothes because winter was coming fast and the maintenance building's heating system ran on electricity I couldn't spare. Medicine from someone's abandoned first aid kit. Pain relievers, antihistamines, antibiotics. A better journal with grid paper to replace the lined notebook I'd nearly filled. One vehicle yielded a propane camping stove with 2 full canisters. Another contained a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures. A third had a toolkit with a variety of useful implements. Each successful scavenging run felt like winning the lottery. Each item represented extended survival, increased comfort, or improved security. The highway was a museum of abandoned lives, and I was its sole curator and beneficiary. Week 7 brought the first serious snowfall. Light dustings at first that melted by afternoon, then heavier storms that buried the highway under 6 inches of powder. The infected continued their wandering, now leaving trails of footprints that made them easier to track on cameras. The snow also revealed something I hadn't noticed before. There were far more infected than I'd thought. At least 100 of them visible within my camera range at any given time, probably thousands more beyond the horizon. The highway hadn't just been an escape route. It had been a death trap that captured and converted most of the people who'd tried to use it. That realization sat heavy in my chest for days. I'd been watching the apocalypse happen from my elevated observation post, but I hadn't fully processed the scale of the disaster. Tens of thousands dead on this highway alone, maybe hundreds of thousands. And that was just one evacuation route. Multiply this scene by every highway leading out of every city, and the numbers became incomprehensible. Humanity hadn't just been wounded, it had been gutted, eviscerated, nearly exterminated. The psychological weight of that knowledge nearly broke me. I spent 3 days barely moving, sitting in the dark maintenance building, staring at nothing. What was the point of surviving if civilization was gone? What was I rationing supplies for? To die of starvation in February instead of January? To freeze when the generator fuel ran out? To eventually make a mistake during a supply run and join the shambling horde outside? Every answer my brain generated was bleak. Depression in isolation is particularly insidious. There's no one to notice you're slipping, no one to pull you back from the edge, no external reason to perform even basic self-care tasks. I stopped eating, stopped checking the cameras, just sat in darkness and contemplated the various ways I could end things on my own terms before the world ended them for me. The tire iron would work, quick and certain, or I could just walk out into the infected horde and let them finish it, or stop eating until the decision was made for me. But humans are stubborn creatures. We cling to life even when life has no apparent purpose. On the 4th day of my depression, something shifted. I can't explain what or why. Maybe it was sunlight coming through the gap under the door. Maybe it was hunger finally overriding despair. Maybe it was just the basic animal drive to survive asserting itself. I forced myself to stand up, eat half a can of soup, check the camera feeds. The routine saved me. The structure saved me. The simple act of doing the next necessary thing saved me. I established new goals, because goals create purpose and purpose creates reasons to continue. Survive until spring because spring meant potential for gardening in the soil between the highway lanes. I'd found seed packets in one of the scavenging runs, tomatoes, beans, squash, and the idea of growing food represented a future beyond mere day-to-day survival. Survive until the infected population decreased through attrition, because nothing lives forever, not even the shambling dead. Eventually, they'd wear out, break down, become manageable. Survive until rescue operations resumed, because governments don't just abandon entire regions permanently, right? Even if those goals were based on desperate optimism rather than realistic assessment, they gave me reasons to wake up each morning. They created a narrative where survival had meaning beyond just not dying. Humans need narrative. We need story. I was writing myself a story where this chapter of isolation was just that, a chapter, not the conclusion. Week 8 marked 2 months of isolation. I celebrated by eating an entire can of peaches I'd found during a scavenging run the previous week. The syrupy sweetness tasted like luxury, like the old world, like hope. I allowed myself 30 minutes to savor them, eating one slice at a time with my eyes closed, pretending I was anywhere but a concrete box surrounded by the infected dead. Then I cleaned the can, added it to my collection of containers, and returned to the business of survival. The generator fuel situation had become critical. I'd been conservative with power usage, but 2 months of running cameras and occasionally heating water had depleted the supply faster than I'd hoped. The maintenance building had 3 large fuel containers, each holding about 20 gallons. The first was empty. The second was three-quarters gone. The third remained my emergency reserve. At current usage rates, I had maybe 3 more weeks of power. After that, I'd be living in complete darkness, with no ability to monitor the infected movements outside. But the highway offered solutions, if you were willing to risk finding them. Vehicles abandoned with quarter tanks or half tanks of gas represented potential fuel sources. I'd seen a siphoning kit in the maintenance building's tool area weeks ago, but hadn't needed it until now. The kit consisted of a manual pump and 20 feet of tubing, simple technology that predated the collapse and would probably outlast it. Siphoning fuel meant extended time near vehicles, which meant extended exposure to infected. But the alternative was going blind to threats. I planned the fuel run for 5 days, studying traffic patterns and identifying target vehicles. A pickup truck sat about 70 yards away in the westbound lanes, positioned slightly away from the main cluster of infected activity. I'd watched it through the cameras for weeks. Nobody had looted it. No infected seemed particularly interested in it. The truck bed was empty, which suggested the owner had traveled light, which suggested they might have left in a hurry with plenty of fuel remaining. Dawn on day 62 was clear and cold. Frost covered everything, making the abandoned vehicles look like sculptures in an apocalyptic art installation. I could see my breath inside the maintenance building despite the small amount of heat I'd allowed myself the night before. I dressed in layers, thermal underwear, jeans, a heavy work shirt, a jacket I'd scavenged from an SUV, gloves with the fingers cut off so I could still manipulate tools. The siphoning kit went into a backpack along with empty fuel containers, the hunting knife, and a flare I'd found that could serve as both light source and potential weapon. The infected count was low, only 12 visible on the camera feeds, and none within 50 yards of the pickup truck. Jerry was at his usual position by the semi. Patricia wandered her eternal circle. Marcus Jr. was out of frame entirely, which made me nervous, but I couldn't wait for perfect conditions. Perfect didn't exist anymore. I moved across the toll plaza using the route I'd refined over dozens of supply runs. Stay low behind the concrete barriers, pause every 10 steps to scan for movement, use vehicles as cover when possible. The frost made the ground slippery, but also created a visibility advantage. I could see fresh footprints from infected who'd passed recently. The area around the pickup showed no prints, which was promising. The truck's fuel door was locked. Of course it was. People locked their fuel doors to prevent theft, a concern from the old world that seemed laughable now. I used the hunting knife to pry at the door, trying to work quietly, but metal on metal created scraping sounds that carried in the cold air. 30 seconds of work, and the door popped open with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I froze, scanned the area, waited for the shambling rush of infected drawn by noise. Nothing moved. The highway remained still, except for the distant figure of Jerry attempting to climb onto his semi-truck. I fed the siphoning tube into the fuel tank and started pumping. Gasoline has a distinct smell that's almost nostalgic now. It represented mobility, freedom, the ability to go anywhere. I watched the clear tube fill with amber liquid and felt like I'd struck oil. The fuel flowed into my first container, then my second. The truck had at least half a tank remaining. This single successful siphon would buy me another month of generator use. The attack came from my blind side. I'd been focused on the fuel, on filling containers, on the mechanical process of the siphon. I'd stopped scanning like I should have. Survival mistake number 1. Never get complacent. The infected man hit me like a linebacker, driving me into the side of the pickup truck, with enough force to crack my ribs. The fuel container spilled, gasoline spreading across the asphalt. We went down together. He was on top of me, hands grasping, mouth opening to bite. I got my left forearm up under his chin, keeping his face away from my throat. His breath smelled like rotten meat. His eyes were milky and unfocused, His skin was gray-white with cold and decay. He snapped at my arm, teeth clicking together inches from my flesh. My right hand scrambled for the hunting knife on my belt. Time does strange things during life-or-death struggles. Seconds stretch into hours. You notice irrelevant details with crystalline clarity. This infected man was wearing a business suit. His tie was still knotted properly. His wedding ring caught the morning light. He'd been someone once, someone with a job and a spouse and a life. Now he was just hunger and aggression wrapped in decaying flesh. I got the knife free, drove it up into his throat, felt resistance. Then the give as the blade punched through tissue. He didn't react to the pain. The infected didn't feel pain. But the damage was structural. I twisted the blade and pulled it sideways, opening a gash that would have been fatal to anything with a functioning circulatory system. He kept trying to bite me. I pushed him off and scrambled backward. He stood up, the gash in his throat gaping open, showing internal structures I'd never wanted to see. He came at me again with that same mechanical persistence. I was ready this time. When he lunged, I sidestepped and drove the knife into the base of his skull where the spine met the brain. Every zombie movie I'd ever watched insisted that brain destruction was the only way to stop them. I'd never had reason to test that theory until now. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings, just collapsed mid-stride and went completely still. The knife stuck in his skull. I had to put my boot on his head to pull it free, which was one of the more grotesque experiences of my life. The blade came out with a wet sound that I'll hear in nightmares until I die. My hands were shaking again, that adrenaline crash I'd learned to expect but could never quite prepare for. I'd killed something that used to be human. Ended whatever remained of a person who'd once worn a suit and tie, who'd once had a name and a family and hopes for the future. The moral weight of that hit me harder than the physical fight had. But I couldn't afford philosophical paralysis. The noise of the struggle would attract others. I grabbed what fuel containers I'd managed to fill, about 7 gallons total, and ran back to the maintenance building using a different route than I'd come. A different infected man appeared from behind a sedan 20 yards away. I didn't engage, just ran, reached the building, got inside, locked the door, pushed the cabinet against it. Only then did I let myself collapse. Only then did I examine the damage. My ribs screamed when I breathed deeply. Bruises were already forming on my left forearm where I'd blocked the bite. My jacket was torn. I was covered in gasoline and probably infected blood, which meant I needed to strip down immediately and wash with the precious water I'd been rationing. The next hour was spent in paranoid terror, examining every inch of exposed skin for bite marks or scratches. The infected person's teeth had clicked against my arm but hadn't broken skin. His hands had grabbed my jacket, but not the flesh underneath. I was pretty sure I hadn't been infected, but pretty sure wasn't certainty. And the next few days would be spent monitoring for symptoms I'd only heard about secondhand from that state trooper on the first night. If you've ever waited to find out if you're infected with something that will turn you into a monster, you understand the specific hell of the next 72 hours. Every minor ache became a symptom. Every moment of tiredness became evidence of transformation. Share this with anyone who thinks they're ready for the apocalypse. The psychological warfare is worse than the physical danger. The fuel I'd collected bought me time, but at a cost I hadn't anticipated. I'd killed someone. Yes, they were infected. Yes, they were trying to kill me. Yes, it was self-defense. But they'd been human once, and I'd driven a knife into their brain and ended whatever remained of their existence. That weight sits differently than abstract survival decisions. It's specific and visceral and permanent. I didn't develop infection symptoms. Day 3 after the attack came and went, without fever or aggression, or the telltale blank expression I'd seen on camera feeds. I'd been lucky. The word lucky meant something different now. Lucky meant you got attacked but didn't get bitten. Lucky meant you survived another day in a world designed to kill you. Lucky meant you got to keep experiencing the isolation and fear and grinding tedium of post-apocalyptic survival. Week 10 brought a cold snap, that dropped temperatures below zero for 5 consecutive days. The maintenance building became a freezer. My breath formed ice crystals on the interior walls. I burned through fuel running a small space heater for a few hours each day, just to prevent hypothermia. The infected outside moved slower in the extreme cold, their joints literally freezing, their movements becoming even more jerky and mechanical. Several of them just stopped moving entirely, becoming frozen statues scattered across the highway. I wondered if winter would solve my infected problem naturally, if the cold would freeze them solid, and I could just wait for spring to thaw a landscape full of corpses rather than threats. But when the temperature rose above freezing on day 6, the frozen infected thawed and resumed their wandering. They were more damaged now, fingers broken off from frostbite, faces showing severe tissue damage from repeated freeze-thaw cycles, but still mobile, still dangerous, still driven by whatever neural pathway remained functional in their deteriorated brains. The extreme cold did provide one benefit: food preservation. The highway became a freezer, and any food I scavenged would stay frozen indefinitely as long as temperatures remained low. I ventured out during the cold snap to hit multiple vehicles, gathering as much food as I could carry. Frozen dinners that were frozen anyway, canned goods that wouldn't burst in the cold, dried foods, anything shelf-stable. I made 4 runs over 3 days and brought back enough supplies to last another 2 months if I was careful. One of those runs took me to a semi-truck, jackknifed across 2 lanes about 100 yards from the toll plaza. I'd avoided it previously because it was right in Jerry's territory, but the cold had frozen Jerry solid against the side of his beloved semi. I could walk right past him without danger. He stood there like a statue, one arm raised as if trying to grasp something, eyes frozen open in that blank stare. I found myself wondering who Jerry had been, what his real name was, whether anyone still alive remembered him. The semi's trailer was locked, but the cab was open. Inside I found the mother lode, a trucker's emergency supplies, cases of bottled water, military-grade MREs, at least 40 of them, a portable generator, smaller than the one in the maintenance building but still valuable, fuel cans, a CB radio, medical supplies, and most importantly, a shotgun with 2 boxes of shells. I'd never fired a gun in my life. My experience with firearms came entirely from movies and video games, which are terrible teachers. But the shotgun represented a psychological advantage as much as a practical one. I could defend myself at range now instead of waiting for infected to get close enough to stab. I could make noise that might scare off other threats. I could feel slightly less helpless. Getting the supplies back to the maintenance building required 3 trips. The last trip, I hauled the portable generator on a hand truck I'd found in the truck's cargo area. Jerry had thought enough to move his head, following my movement with those dead eyes, but his body remained frozen in place. I gave him a nod as I passed. Whatever he'd been, he'd inadvertently provided me with supplies that might save my life. That deserved acknowledgement. Week 12 marked 3 months in the toll booth observation post. 3 months since I'd processed that last silver sedan. 3 months since civilization had evacuated past my window and died on the highway. 3 months of isolation, fear, near-death experiences, and the grinding routine of survival. I was still alive. That counted for something. I'd changed during those 3 months in ways I couldn't fully articulate. My body was leaner, harder adapted to the physical demands of scavenging and the sparse diet. My mind was different too, more focused on immediate survival concerns, less capable of abstract thinking or long-term planning beyond basic resource management. I thought in terms of zones and threats, and supply runs rather than days of the week or months of the year. Time had become meaningless except as a way to mark the intervals between necessary tasks. The psychological isolation was worse than the physical danger. Days would pass where I didn't speak out loud to anyone, including myself. My voice started to sound strange on the rare occasions I used it, like it belonged to someone else. I'd catch myself having full conversations in my head, debating decisions from multiple angles, but the arguments all used my own internal voice. There was no dissent, no external perspective, no one to tell me when I was being irrational or paranoid, or missing an obvious solution. I started writing letters in my journal to people I'd known before the collapse, my supervisor Derek, my brother in California who I hadn't spoken to in 2 years, a woman named Sarah I dated briefly 6 months before everything fell apart. I wrote to them about what I was experiencing, asked them questions I'd never get answers to, apologized for things left unsaid before the world ended. I knew they were probably dead, but the act of writing to them created the illusion of communication, of connection, of a world beyond the concrete walls of my survival box. The camera feeds showed a slowly changing landscape. The infected population was decreasing through attrition. Some had wandered off down the highway toward destinations they'd never remember or reach. Some had frozen and not thawed. Some had simply worn out. Bodies can't function indefinitely without fuel, and the infected didn't eat in any meaningful way. By month 3, I was counting maybe 30 infected in my camera range instead of the 100+ from month 2. But new ones appeared occasionally, wandering up the highway from the direction of the city. These were different from the earlier infected. They showed more advanced decay, their clothes hanging off emaciated frames, their movements even more impaired. Whatever had happened in the city was still producing infected, or these were stragglers who'd been wandering for months and only now reached this section of highway. Either way, the threat wasn't diminishing as quickly as I'd hoped. Week 14 brought the first signs of spring. Temperatures rose above freezing consistently. Snow melted, revealing the full scope of the automotive graveyard in harsh clarity. Rust had already started claiming the vehicles, paint fading, metal corroding. Nature was beginning the slow process of reclaiming the highway. I saw weeds growing in the cracks of the asphalt. Birds had returned, building nests in abandoned cars. Life persisted even in the shadow of death. Spring also meant I could begin my gardening project. I'd found a manual on survival gardening in one of the vehicles. Someone had been preparing for exactly this scenario. The soil between highway lanes wasn't ideal, but it was soil, and I had seeds, and growing food represented a path toward long-term survival beyond just scavenging from a dwindling supply. I selected a plot about 40 yards from the maintenance building, close enough to protect, but far enough that I wasn't advertising my presence. The soil was compacted from years under vehicle traffic, so I spent a week breaking it up with tools from the maintenance building. A pickaxe to break the hard surface, a shovel to turn the soil. My hands blistered, then calloused. My back screamed after each session, but I was creating something rather than just surviving, and that psychological shift was vital. The infected showed interest in my gardening activities. Movement attracted them. But they lost interest once I stopped moving, and the low fence I constructed from scavenged materials created enough of a barrier that they couldn't easily access the garden even if they wanted to. I planted tomatoes, beans, squash, and carrots in neat rows, following the manual's instructions. I used water from my rainwater collection to irrigate. I protected the seedlings with plastic sheeting from vehicle interiors. Would the garden produce food? Maybe. The manual gave me maybe 50-50 odds in compacted highway soil with my limited knowledge. But the act of gardening gave me purpose. It forced me to think weeks and months ahead rather than just day to day. It created hope that survival might be possible not just for 4 months, but for 4 years. Forever even. The CB radio from the semi-truck had become my evening ritual. Every night I'd power it on and scan through channels, listening to static. Occasionally I'd transmit, calling out my location and situation, asking if anyone could hear me. The response was always silence. But I kept trying, because the alternative was accepting that I might be the only living human within broadcast range. And that acceptance led to the kind of despair that ends with a tire iron and a quick exit. On day 103, The radio crackled with something that wasn't static, a voice, male, distant, breaking up through interference but definitely human. Convoy moving west on Highway 40. Avoid the cities. Seeking survivors, checkpoint at mile marker 215. I grabbed the microphone with shaking hands. This is Marcus Webb at the Highway 40 toll plaza, approximately mile marker 187. I'm alive. I can hear you. Please respond. Static. Then, copy that toll plaza. Convoy will reach your position in approximately 3 days. Prepare for extraction. Do you require medical attention? Negative on medical. I'm healthy. I have supplies. 3 days. Understood. How many survivors have you found? More static. The voice faded in and out. 43 survivors collected, establishing safe zone, military and civilian cooperation. If you can hear this, make your way to Highway 40, mile marker 215. I called back for an hour, but the transmission didn't repeat. Either they'd moved out of range or the atmospheric conditions that had briefly allowed communication had shifted. But I'd heard human voices, plural. A convoy, military and civilian cooperation, a safe zone, the possibility of rescue after 4 months of isolation. I spent the next 3 days in frantic preparation. I organized my supplies, gathered everything portable that might be useful. I documented my experience in detailed journal entries in case the convoy was interested in information about infected behavior and survival strategies. I shaved with cold water and a razor I'd scavenged, wanting to look human rather than like a wild man emerging from the woods. I cleaned the maintenance building, though I wasn't sure why. Some lingering social instinct about receiving guests. The real question was whether to trust the transmission. It could be legitimate. It could be bandits using military jargon to lure survivors into ambush. It could be my imagination, a hallucination born from isolation and desperation. I had no way to verify anything. But staying in the toll plaza forever wasn't viable. Supplies would eventually run out, equipment would fail, winter would return, worse than the last one. If there was a chance for actual rescue, I had to take it. Day 106 arrived. I spent the morning on the camera feeds, watching the highway to the east for signs of approaching vehicles. Nothing. Afternoon came and went. Evening brought darkness and doubt. Maybe I'd misheard the timeline. Maybe the convoy had been destroyed by infected. Maybe it had never existed at all. Then, just after sunset, lights appeared on the eastern horizon. Not the scattered beams of abandoned vehicles with dying batteries, but organized headlights moving in formation. 4 vehicles, traveling in a convoy pattern with the military precision suggested by the radio transmission. They were real. Rescue was real. I grabbed my supplies and the shotgun and stepped outside the maintenance building for the last time. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of growing things from my small garden. The infected nearest to the toll plaza had noticed the convoy lights and were shambling toward them. Jerry had finally abandoned his semi-truck and was part of the small horde moving east. Patricia had broken her eternal circle. Even Marcus Jr. was visible, lurching toward the lights with his characteristic lopsided gait. The convoy stopped about a quarter-mile away, probably assessing the situation, counting infected, determining whether the rescue was worth the risk. I fired the shotgun into the air, the blast echoing across the highway. Every infected in range turned toward me. I fired again. Now I was the stimulus, the attraction, drawing them away from the convoy and toward my position. I had maybe 2 minutes before the first infected reached me. I used the time to climb onto the maintenance building's roof, using a ladder I'd positioned for exactly this purpose. The roof gave me elevation and defensive advantage. The infected couldn't climb. I could shoot down at them if necessary. The convoy would see me up here, understand I was the survivor they'd come to extract. The convoy started moving again, accelerating toward my position. The infected reached the base of the building and began their mindless attempts to reach me. I counted 14 of them including my named trio. Jerry looked up at me with those dead eyes. Patricia reached uselessly toward the roof. Marcus Jr. pounded on the building's wall with his one good hand, the broken one hanging useless at his side. I'd spent 4 months watching these creatures, naming them, learning their patterns. They'd been my only companions in isolation. Now I was going to leave them behind, let the convoy deal with them however they dealt with infected. It felt like abandonment, which was insane because they were monsters wearing human skin. But 4 months of isolation does strange things to your attachments. The convoy pulled up to the toll plaza in a coordinated maneuver I'd seen in military movies. 2 vehicles created a defensive perimeter, while the third maneuvered to allow me to jump from the roof to its top. Soldiers in proper protective gear emerged, carrying automatic weapons, moving with the confidence of people who'd done this extraction dozens of times before. A soldier looked up at me and shouted, "Marcus Webb, that's me. How many survivors at this location?" "Just me. Any injured? Any infected?" "I'm clean, healthy, ready to move." "Then let's go. We've got 12 more miles to cover before dark." I jumped from the maintenance building roof to the vehicle's roof, then was helped down into the armored interior by hands that belonged to living, breathing humans. The convoy started moving before I was fully inside. Through the window, I watched the toll plaza recede into the distance. My concrete box, my observation post, my home for 4 months. The infected were already losing interest, returning to their purposeless wandering. The soldier across from me offered a bottle of water. "You've been alone for 4 months, since the first night of the evacuation. I'm a toll collector, was a toll collector. I saw the whole thing happen from my booth. You're the first survivor we found who witnessed the initial outbreak. Command is going to want a full debrief. Everything you saw, everything you documented." I touched the journal in my pack. 4 months of observations, survival strategies, psychological warfare, and letters to the dead. I documented everything. Infected behavior patterns, survival techniques, resource management. It's all in here. The soldier nodded. "Good. That information will save lives. There are more survivors than you think. Pockets of resistance. Safe zones forming. You're not alone anymore, Marcus." I should have felt relief, joy, gratitude. But what I felt was a strange sense of loss mixed with overwhelming exhaustion. 4 months of hypervigilance had trained my brain to expect threats from every direction. The absence of immediate danger felt wrong, like I'd forgotten something critical. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. My body didn't understand that the survival ordeal was over. "How many survivors total?" I asked. "In our region?" "Maybe 3,000 that we know of, nationwide. No idea. Communications are still spotty, but there are enough of us to rebuild, enough to fight back, enough to survive." 3,000 out of a metropolitan population of millions. The math was brutal, but 3,000 was more than 0. More than 1. It was enough to be called humanity rather than just scattered remnants. The convoy reached the checkpoint at mile marker 215 as full darkness fell. It was a fortified position, established in a highway rest stop, with walls made from vehicles and shipping containers, watchtowers staffed by armed guards, and lights powered by generators that represented safety and civilization. I saw maybe 50 people moving around inside the perimeter. Real people, alive, talking, working together. They processed me at the gate. Medical examination to confirm I wasn't infected or carrying disease. Decontamination shower with actual hot water. Clean clothes. A real meal with hot food and vegetables that didn't come from a can. A bunk in a communal sleeping area where other survivors were already settling in for the night. Simple things that had been luxuries 4 months ago. I couldn't sleep. Too many people. Too much noise. Too much stimulus after months of isolation and silence. I lay in the bunk and listened to the sounds of breathing, Snoring, someone crying quietly in a corner. Human sounds. I'd survived. Against probability and luck and the collapse of civilization, I'd survived. The next morning, they brought me to command for debriefing. A man who introduced himself as Colonel Harrison sat across a table and listened to my story. All of it. The first night of evacuations, the traffic jam, the fire, the infected, the supply runs, the isolation, the garden, the 4 months of watching humanity's exodus fail on a rural highway. I gave him the journal. He flipped through it, stopping occasionally to read passages in detail. This is valuable intelligence. Your observations about infected behavior, their patterns, their limitations. We've been compiling data from survivors trying to understand what we're dealing with. This contributes significantly to that understanding. Are we winning? I asked. Against the infected, I mean. Is humanity going to survive this? Harrison closed the journal. Honestly, I don't know. The infected aren't reproducing or adapting, which gives us an advantage. They wear out. They decay. Winter killed thousands of them, but there are still millions out there, maybe tens of millions. We're establishing safe zones, clearing regions, trying to rebuild infrastructure. It's going to take years, maybe decades, but we're still here. That counts for something. What happens to me now? You'll be assigned to a work detail based on your skills and experience. We need everyone contributing. Food production, fortification, scavenging. We're building something here, Marcus. A new civilization on the bones of the old one. You survived 4 months alone in a toll booth. That kind of resilience is exactly what we need. They assigned me to the supply coordination team. Turns out sitting in a toll booth watching traffic for 6 years gave me exactly the observational skills needed to manage logistics and resource flow. I helped organize scavenging runs, tracked supply levels, coordinated distribution of food and medicine. It was meaningful work that contributed to collective survival rather than just my own. But I requested one additional assignment. Every week, I climbed one of the watchtowers and spent a few hours watching the highway. Old habits from 4 months in the observation post. I'd watch the empty road, the scattered infected, the slow reclamation of infrastructure by nature. Sometimes I'd see convoys returning with new survivors or supplies. Sometimes I'd see infected hordes that required military response. And sometimes, late at night when the watchtower was empty except for me, I'd think about the toll plaza, about the maintenance building that had been my fortress, about Jerry and Patricia and Marcus Jr. and the dozens of other infected I'd named and watched. They'd been my only companions during the isolation, and some twisted part of my brain missed them. 6 months after my rescue, a scavenging team reported that the Highway 40 toll plaza had been completely overrun by vegetation. My garden had gone wild, growing unchecked, producing food that nobody would harvest. The maintenance building still stood, but was surrounded by infected who'd taken up permanent residence in the area. The cameras had probably stopped working months ago when the generator fuel finally ran out. My observation post had become what all human structures eventually become: ruins, a monument to survival and isolation, and the brief period when one man watched civilization die from a toll collector's booth. The team asked if I wanted to go back, clear the infected, reclaim the site as a forward observation position for the safe zone's expansion. I declined. Some chapters need to stay closed. The toll plaza had saved my life and nearly broken my mind. I'd survived 4 months there, but I didn't need to return. That version of Marcus Webb, isolated, paranoid, naming infected like pets, could remain in the past where he belonged. But I kept the journal, still write in it occasionally, document the rebuilding process, the slow expansion of safe zones, the gradual decrease in infected populations, the births of new children in the settlements, babies who would grow up in this new world without memory of the old one, the small victories and major setbacks of humanity's fight to reclaim the planet. And sometimes I write letters to the dead. To Derek, my supervisor who told me to stay at my post and inadvertently saved my life. To that state trooper who gave me the only information I had before communications died. To Jerry and Patricia and Marcus Jr., the infected who wandered past my cameras for 4 months and never knew they were being watched. The apocalypse didn't end. It just became normal. We adapted because that's what humans do. We survive. We build. We create meaning and structure and civilization out of chaos and death. I survived 4 months in a highway toll booth watching the Exodus. That experience taught me more about human resilience and psychology than any textbook could. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for listening. Thank you for bearing witness to my survival. Share this with someone who needs to understand that even the darkest isolation can be survived, that even when civilization collapses, humanity persists. We're still here. We're still fighting. And we're going to rebuild this world one toll plaza, one safe zone, one survivor at a time. The highway is quiet now, but it won't be forever. Someday, traffic will flow again. Someday, someone will sit in a toll booth and wave cars through without imagining infected hordes and apocalyptic fires. Someday, this will all be history instead of immediate memory. Until then, we survive, we document, we rebuild, and we remember that every single day we wake up breathing is a victory against impossible odds. This is Marcus Webb, former toll collector, apocalypse survivor, signing off. If you're reading this in some future where the world has been rebuilt, know that people like me held the line when everything fell apart. We watched, we documented, we survived, and we never gave up hope.